She apologized for being late. The Mafia boss noticed she was limping, and that was the moment her whole life stopped pretending everything was fine. If you've ever smiled through pain so no one would ask questions, if you've ever shown up somewhere important carrying an injury, an insult, or a secret you weren't ready to explain, this story is going to hit somewhere deep. Picture downtown Chicago at night. Rain hammering glass towers and marble floors. A woman in a soaked coat dragging one step behind the other, praying nobody notices the way her ankle buckles with every stride, the tremor in her hands, the shame she's been carrying so long it started to feel like skin. But one man in that room notices everything. This isn't just a romance. It's a story about being underestimated, about surviving people who told you your worth had a size and a shape. And what happens when the most dangerous man in the city sees exactly what everyone else chose to ignore? Stay with me until the end. Like this video and comment where you're watching from. Now, back to that night. She only said sorry for being late. She had no idea the man watching from the doorway had already decided the world would never humiliate her again. Rain came down hard on Chicago that night. The kind that turned Michigan Avenue into a river of taillights, the kind that soaked through even a good coat in under a minute. Eleanor Hayes pushed through the revolving doors of the Ashcombe Hotel, her heels skidding on wet marble, her sprained ankle screaming with every step. She caught herself against the wall, breathed, straightened up. Not tonight. She couldn't be late tonight. Her phone had buzzed 4 times in the cab. Miriam's assistant, then Miriam herself, then a text from Victor that just said, "Typical." One word. He always knew exactly how many letters it took to make her feel small. She'd shoved the phone back in her bag without answering, the way she'd learned to do with most things that hurt lately. Swallow it, keep moving, deal with it later, when later never actually came. 26 years old, warm hazel eyes, tired at the edges tonight. Dark chocolate curls falling loose from a bun she'd pinned in the back of a cab with shaking hands. Her curves filled out the deep blue dress she'd bought for exactly this kind of night, the kind where she was supposed to fade into the background and just do her job. She pulled her oversized coat tighter around her, made herself small. She always did in rooms like this. She limped into the ballroom. Chandeliers threw gold light over 300 of the city's wealthiest guests, over champagne towers and a string quartet playing something soft and expensive, over a floor so polished she could see the blurred shape of her own reflection moving unevenly across it. The air smelled like lilies and old money. None of it belonged to her, and for one terrible second she felt that truth land in her chest like a stone dropped down a well. "I'm sorry, I'm late," she whispered, to no one, to everyone. Miriam Caldwell got to her first. Her heels struck the marble like punctuation, sharp and final. Her voice sliced clean through the music. "Eleanor, of course you're late. Look at you. You are not the image this company sells. We don't need reminding why you belong in the back office." Heads turned, whispers spread like smoke. Across the room, Victor Langford, her ex, lifted his champagne glass and smiled, like a man watching his own plan finally pay off. Her face burned. That's what shame does in public. It doesn't just embarrass you, it shrinks you. Makes you believe for one ugly second that you deserve it. Her hand closed around her bag strap, knuckles white. When she bent to grab a folder that slipped from her arm, an old cream envelope fell out with it, sliding almost to Miriam's shoe before Eleanor's hand shot out and caught it. Hand-written across the front, faded ink, "Per la Regina." For the Queen. She didn't even know how it got in her bag. Some courier had bumped into her outside, apologized, hurried off before she could even ask his name. But she shoved it back before anyone could see, her fingers trembling so badly it took her 2 tries to get the clasp shut. Nobody in that room cared. Except one man. Dominic Voss walked in, and the crowd split around him like water around a stone. Conversation didn't stop so much as it simply forgot how to continue. His men fanned out without a sound. His eyes moved once across the ballroom, and stopped. Not on Miriam's cruelty, not on Victor's smirk, on the slight hitch in Eleanor's stride, on the corner of an envelope disappearing into her bag. A man who reads danger for a living learns to read pain just as fast, and what he saw in her wasn't weakness. It was someone who'd trained herself to hurt quietly so nobody else had to look at it. He lifted one hand. 20 men in black suits froze mid-step. He peeled off his gloves, slow, one finger at a time. The thing he only did, people said, in front of something sacred. The room went dead silent. Eleanor stammered an apology to nobody in particular. Dominic crossed the floor toward her, unhurried, his eyes never leaving her ankle, never leaving that bag. She didn't know that envelope was the last thing his mother ever gave him. She didn't know he'd recognized her the second he walked through the door. Was Miriam just cruel, or was she someone who'd learned that tearing other people down was the only power she had left? You tell me. Because by morning, that insult was going to cost her everything. The days after blurred into routine. Miriam always found something new. A comment about Eleanor's plate at lunch, a joke about brand image, dropped in front of clients like it was nothing, tossed off so casually that nobody else in the room even registered it as cruelty. That was the worst part, Eleanor had learned. Cruelty delivered lightly enough didn't look like cruelty to anyone but the person absorbing it. Everyone else just heard a joke. She heard a verdict. Eleanor ate alone in the corner of the break room, tray balanced on her knees because she didn't trust herself not to spill something if she sat too close to the window where people could see her. She'd done it for 2 years, ever since Victor first convinced her she took up too much space in the world. Funny how that works. One person's voice gets stuck in your head, and after a while, you can't tell it apart from your own. She used to think that voice was just honesty. Now, some nights, lying awake, she wondered how long it would take to unlearn a thing that had been drilled into her for years by someone who'd sworn he loved her. Victor never laid a hand on her. He didn't need to. He just told her, quietly, over and over, that she should be grateful anyone wanted her at all. That a woman built like her should count her blessings, should stop expecting the world to make room. For a long time, she believed him. Control rarely looks like control from the inside. Mostly it just looks like love with strings attached, wrapped up so carefully in concern, and I'm only telling you this because I care that by the time you notice the strings, you've already tied yourself to them. Tuesday morning, gray light through the office windows, the kind of flat overcast that made everything look a little unfinished. Victor cornered her by the elevators, shoved a folder into her hand so hard the corner dug into her palm. "Sign it, today." The charm was gone from his voice. What was left sounded a lot like panic, a thin, high note underneath the words that she'd never heard from him before, not even in their worst arguments. Before she could answer, a black Rolls-Royce pulled up outside the glass doors, water sheeting off its hood in the drizzle. Dominic stepped out, crossed the lobby without looking at anyone else, footsteps unhurried on the polished floor, and pressed a folded silk handkerchief into her hand, the Voss crest stitched into the corner in silver thread, the fabric still faintly warm from his pocket. "You dropped this," he said. She hadn't. Victor went pale as paper, his mouth opening and then closing again with nothing in it. Co-workers traded glances over their coffee, the kind of glances that meant this story would be circulating by lunch, embellished a little more with every retelling. That evening, he brought her up to a private suite at the Ashcombe, some excuse about a security matter tied to the foundation, though they both understood by then it wasn't really about that. The suite smelled like cedar and rain through an open window. He knelt down without asking and wrapped her ankle himself, his hands careful, unhurried, the calluses on his fingers rough against her skin in a way that should have felt strange from a stranger, and instead felt like something closer to safety. Rain traced lines down the window behind him, gold streetlight bleeding through the glass. Neither of them said anything for a while. She found herself watching the crown of his bent head and thinking, absurdly, that she hadn't been touched with this much care in longer than she wanted to admit. When she pointed out, quietly, almost apologizing for it, the old habit of shrinking her own intelligence before anyone could shrink it for her, a discrepancy buried 3 pages into the Foundation's financial records, numbers that didn't add up, a signature that didn't belong. He looked up at her like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. His gray eyes held hers a beat too long, long enough that she felt her pulse pick up in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He slid a cup of tea across the table, steam curling up between them. "Miriam told you that you don't belong around money like this," he said. "She has no idea. Your mind is worth more than anything in this hotel." Her eyes stung. Years since anyone had told her she was more than what she looked like. She turned her face toward the window so he wouldn't see it. But he saw it anyway. And he didn't say anything about it, which somehow made it worse and better at once. Healing doesn't always show up as some big moment. Sometimes it's just one sentence, from someone who finally sees what you stopped believing was there. Her friend Sophia pulled her aside the next day, in the stairwell where the cameras didn't reach, voice dropped to barely more than breath. "Victor borrowed money from your family. Years ago," she said. "I don't think he ever paid it back. And I think he's terrified you're finally going to notice." Sophia's dark eyes were wide, worried, her usual brightness dimmed by the seriousness of what she was saying. "Be careful, Elle. A cornered man does stupid things." That night, alone in her apartment, the radiator ticking, rain still tapping the fire escape outside, Eleanor spread the old records across her table and let her memory do what it always did. Hold every number, every date, every signature, locked in place, permanent, unshakable, the one part of herself nobody had ever managed to convince her wasn't extraordinary. Piece by piece, the pattern came together, the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, faint shapes sharpening into something undeniable. Victor's handwriting, on documents he had no business touching. Her hands went cold as the picture completed itself. Next morning, through a half-open office door, she heard him mutter to Miriam, his voice pitched low, but not low enough. "She won't figure it out. She never does." Miriam laughed, cold, thin, satisfied. Her hands shook, but not from shame this time. Something else moved under her ribs, hot, unfamiliar, almost frightening in its intensity. There's a moment fear turns into something else, resolve, maybe, when you realize the story other people wrote about you is smaller than what you're actually capable of proving. That night, Dominic found her in the corridor outside her apartment, standing under the yellow hallway light like he'd been waiting there a while. His voice dropped low. "You're not someone I'm protecting anymore, Eleanor. You're becoming someone I need."
He said it like a confession, like something that cost him to admit, and for a moment the mask of controlled calm slipped just enough that she saw, underneath it, someone as uncertain as she was. She still didn't know it. Victor wasn't just trying to control her, he was using her name to bring down an empire, and the envelope sealed shut in her bag was the one thing that could stop him.
The emergency meeting got called for 9 the next morning. Fluorescent light, the smell of burnt coffee from the machine nobody ever cleaned. 12 executives arranged around a table like pieces on a board nobody had asked them if they wanted to play. Miriam stood at the head of the table, voice cracking with panic she was trying and failing to disguise as authority. "We're about to lose the Whitfield contract, and Eleanor is the reason. She's a burden to this company's image." Victor said nothing. Didn't need to. His smile said it for him, small and satisfied, tucked into the corner of his mouth like he thought no one could see it. Then the door opened. Dominic walked in without knocking, Marco a shadow behind him, the door swinging shut with a soft, final click that seemed louder than it should have been. "Eleanor Hayes is under my protection." That was all he said. The room's temperature dropped 10 degrees. Executives who'd looked straight through her for 2 years suddenly sat up straight, spines snapping into place like they'd been electrocuted. Funny how fast people's respect can shift, not because she changed, but because someone finally showed them where to look. In the small office afterward, glass walls fogged faintly from the difference in temperature, she laid the falsified contracts across the desk, one by one, her hands steady now in a way they hadn't been in weeks. Every forged signature, exactly as she'd memorized it, down to the stroke, the slight hesitation in the pen where a real signature would have flowed. "I don't need pity," she said, meeting his eyes and holding them. "I need the truth to matter." There was more in that line than defiance. It was the sound of a woman drawing a boundary for maybe the first time in her life, choosing her own dignity over being rescued. "I need you," he said. Simple as that. No qualifiers, no softening. Just the fact of it, laid bare between them like another piece of evidence on the table. He'd already started freezing Victor's accounts before the meeting even began, he told her, sliding a second folder across the desk, his own evidence stacked neatly against hers. Paperwork was sitting with his lawyers, just waiting on one last piece of proof. That proof showed up an hour later, in the hallway outside the elevators, fluorescent light buzzing overhead. Victor caught her alone, all his charm burned off, his grip tightening around her arm hard enough to bruise. "You have no idea what you're about to destroy," he hissed, his breath sour with old coffee and something sharper underneath. Panic, maybe, or the first taste of consequences finally catching up to him. Fear does that to a man who built his whole identity on controlling someone else. The second that control slips, the mask goes with it. She didn't flinch. She looked at him the way she used to look away, steady, unblinking, her pulse loud in her own ears, but her face giving away nothing. That's the whole transformation, right there, in one small shift, meeting his eyes instead of lowering hers. Fear stops being a reflex. It becomes a choice she's just not making anymore. Dominic stepped out of the shadows behind her, one hand on her shoulder, voice gone to ice, quiet enough that it somehow carried further than shouting would have. "You were saying someone was going to regret something?" Victor's knees nearly gave out. His hand fell away from her arm like it had touched something hot. He didn't say another word, just backed away down the hallway, his footsteps echoing until they weren't audible at all. For the first time in years, she felt what it meant to be protected, not because she was fragile, but because she was worth defending. Investors who'd never once looked her way now knew her name. Waitstaff who used to walk past her held the door open, called her Ms. Hayes with a small deferential nod she wasn't sure she'd ever get used to. That night, a name surfaced that changed everything. Julian. Dominic's own brother, meeting quietly with a rival family for weeks in restaurants far from downtown, in conversations conducted in the kind of hushed, careful tones that only ever meant betrayal. Somewhere beneath the marble floors and the charity galas, an empire was about to get tested, and the envelope Eleanor still hadn't opened sat closer to the center of it than either of them knew. 5 days later, the rival family made their move. Right at the Foundation's annual gala, under the same chandeliers, the same string quartet, as if the universe wanted her to stand exactly where she'd stood the night this all began. Julian had been fed promises by men who wanted the Voss empire weakened from the inside. Promises about respect, about finally stepping out of his brother's shadow, about being seen as his own man instead of the quiet, overlooked younger Voss. He didn't understand, not until it was far too late, that he'd become somebody else's pawn. It's an old story. The younger brother, hungry for a kind of significance the older one already claimed, mistaking manipulation for opportunity, mistaking men who flattered him for men who respected him. Midway through the gala, agents Dominic didn't recognize approached him. Calm, official, badges catching the chandelier light, a folder of fabricated evidence in hand. Evidence built, Eleanor would soon realize, out of documents carrying Victor's forgeries. The music kept playing, absurdly, as if the room hadn't noticed the ground shifting under it. Victor watched from the bar, satisfied, swirling his glass, sure that in a few minutes Dominic would be led out in front of everyone who mattered, in front of every investor and socialite whose respect he'd spent years building. 5 minutes. That's all that stood between them and the whole thing collapsing. The case going public, the biggest deal of the family's international business falling apart with it. Years of careful, legitimate work undone in one engineered scandal. Eleanor felt her heart slam against her ribs, felt the old instinct rise, shrink, disappear, let someone else handle it. And for one breath, she almost listened to it. Then she didn't. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the old envelope from her bag, the one she'd been carrying for weeks without knowing what it meant, and laid it beside the falsified contracts, memorized down to every misplaced comma. Her voice, when she spoke, came out steadier than she felt, steadier than she'd ever managed in any boardroom in her life. In front of the stunned crowd, in front of the waiting agents, she walked the room through every discrepancy herself. The mismatched dates, the signature that wasn't Julian's at all, the trail that led every time straight back to Victor. There's a kind of courage that only shows up under pressure. Not the absence of fear, just the decision that the truth matters more than staying safe. Dominic could have stopped her, could have pulled every string he had left and let the deal quietly die to keep the spotlight off himself. Instead, he let her finish, stood beside her, silent, his presence somehow louder than anything he could have said, and chose to lose it all rather than let her be silenced. It's rare, watching someone choose a person over an empire in real time. Rarer still, watching it land not like sacrifice, but like relief. Like he'd been waiting his whole life to want something bigger than power. "You're the only thing I've ever been willing to lose everything for," he told her, quiet enough that only she heard it, his hand finding hers beneath the edge of the table, steady, grounding. By the time she finished, the agent's folder didn't mean anything anymore. The real evidence was already in her hands, and it pointed one direction. Julian's face, when the truth landed on him, went through something almost worse than anger, a kind of collapse, the look of a man realizing exactly how badly he'd been used. He was led away, not by outside enforcers, but by his own family's decision. Stripped of his title, sent to a secluded estate in Italy to sit with what loyalty was supposed to mean. The gala didn't applaud. It just went quiet. The way a room goes quiet when it realizes it's been watching the wrong woman the whole time. And that was only the start of who she was about to become. Within a month, federal investigators opened a formal inquiry into Victor's finances. His account stayed frozen, his name quietly dropped from every guest list that had once welcomed him. Miriam couldn't distance herself from the scandal fast enough. She was quietly pushed out of her role, her office cleared out on a Friday afternoon when she thought no one would notice. Julian stayed in Italy, his inheritance on hold, indefinitely, learning slowly what it cost to trade family for men who'd never really wanted him at all. The weeks in between passed strangely for Eleanor, caught somewhere between disbelief and a kind of cautious, unfamiliar peace. She kept waiting for the ground to shift again, for some new humiliation to come find her the way it always had, and when it didn't come, she almost didn't know what to do with the quiet. She'd wake some mornings in her own apartment. She hadn't moved into the penthouse yet, hadn't let herself get ahead of things that fast, and lie there in the gray, early light, just listening to the city outside, half expecting a text from Victor, a summons from Miriam, some small cruelty waiting to reassert itself. None ever came. The silence took getting used to. It felt some days almost like grief, grieving the version of herself who had learned to survive by staying small, who no longer had a place in this new, wider life unfolding around her. Sophia showed up one evening with a bottle of cheap wine and a box of pastries from the bakery near their old office, and the two of them sat on Eleanor's fire escape the way they used to when things were bad, except now there was nothing bad to talk through, just the strange, giddy work of catching up with a friend who'd watched the whole transformation happen in real time.
"I still can't believe you just stood there," Sophia said, shaking her head, "in front of everyone, and told them exactly how it was." She bumped Eleanor's shoulder with her own. "You've always had that in you, you know. You just needed someone to stop telling you to hide it." At the next gala, same ballroom where she'd once whispered an apology just for existing, the same chandeliers throwing the same gold light, though nothing about the room felt the same to her anymore, Eleanor got announced. Not as an assistant, as director of the Voss Foundation's new outreach division. The applause that followed felt different from any sound that room had ever made for her before. Warm, real, unhesitating. She stood at the podium for a moment longer than she needed to, just to feel it, just to let it land somewhere deep enough that she'd remember it on the hard days still to come. Her hands, she noticed, weren't shaking anymore. Dominic slid the family ring onto her finger in front of everyone who'd once looked past her, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, his eyes never leaving her face. "This isn't because I protected you," he said. "It's because you saved me." The room seemed to hold its breath along with her. Somewhere near the back, she caught sight of an older woman in emeralds she vaguely recognized from that very first night, the one who'd murmured about funerals and gloves, now watching her with something like quiet approval, raising her glass in a small, private toast. She stood taller than she ever had. Her curves weren't something to hide under an oversized coat anymore, just part of the woman the whole room now knew by name. Victor gave a stiff, forced apology in front of the board, his voice flat, his eyes anywhere but hers. Miriam, cornered by her own downfall, did the same, and Eleanor found she felt nothing sharp about it anymore. Just a quiet, settled kind of peace, the sense of a door finally closing. She realized, standing there listening to Miriam force the words out through clenched teeth, that she'd spent so long imagining this moment as revenge, and now that it had arrived, it didn't feel like winning at all. It just felt like being finally, fully believed. Eleanor walked through that room the way she used to imagine other women walked, unhurried, unapologetic, all the way present. No more whispering sorry to the marble floor. Turns out her confidence was never about how she looked. It was about refusing to shrink for people who never deserved the room she gave them. Dominic handed her the management of the family's legitimate charitable trust, the same one his mother used to run. The same one that envelope belonged to all along, the paper inside finally read, finally understood, tucked now into a frame on the desk that would soon be hers. She kept it there for the rest of her life, in every office she'd ever occupy after that night. A small, faded reminder of the moment a stranger's kindness and a dead woman's letter had quietly rewritten the whole shape of her future. That night, in the quiet of his penthouse high above the rain-soaked city, Eleanor stood in front of the mirror, the way she hadn't let herself in years. Just looking. No judgment. At the body that had carried her through every humiliation and out the other side. Every curve and line of her finally just hers again, belonging to no one's cruelty but her own quiet acceptance. The penthouse was dark except for the lamp in the corner and the endless gold smear of the city through floor-to-ceiling glass, rain still tracing slow lines down the windows like it had been doing since the night she first limped through the Ashcombs' doors. She'd taken off the ring, just for a moment, and set it on the dresser beside her, not because she didn't want it, but because she wanted to look at herself once without anything borrowed, without any title attached to her name. She wanted to know if the woman in the mirror could stand there and simply be enough,
No gala, no crest, no Dominic Voss standing behind her to prove it. Her hands trembled slightly as she let her robe fall open at the shoulder, studying the soft slope of her arm, the fullness of her hip, the stretch marks silvering pale across skin she'd spent years covering in oversized coats and dark, forgiving fabric. She remembered Victor's voice, low and almost gentle, the way cruelty always disguised itself as concern. "You'd be so much happier if you just tried harder." And she waited for the old shame to come find her the way it always used to, curling up from her stomach into her throat. It didn't come. She stood there a long moment, almost suspicious of the silence where the shame used to live, before she understood. It simply wasn't there anymore. She'd outgrown the room where that voice used to sit. Dominic wrapped his arms around her from behind, chin resting on her shoulder, his reflection settling into the mirror beside hers like it had always belonged there. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked. Really looked, the way he had that very first night, except now there was nothing left to hide from him. No envelope, no secret, no fear dressed up as composure. His hands slid slowly over her arms, not asking her to be smaller, not asking her to be anything other than exactly what she was standing there being. "You keep looking at yourself like you're waiting to be told you're allowed," he said quietly, his voice rough at the edges. "You don't need my permission, Eleanor. You never did." Her breath caught. Something in her chest loosened. Some final knot she hadn't even realized was still tied. "Old habits," she whispered. "Then we'll build new ones." He pressed his lips to her shoulder, unhurried, and she felt the words settle into her skin like something permanent. "May I kiss you?" Quiet, certain. She turned in his arms and answered him herself, her hands rising to frame his face the way she'd never once let herself imagine doing that first humiliating night in the ballroom. The kiss was slow, unhurried, nothing at all like the desperate, apologetic way she used to move through the world. It felt instead like a decision, like something chosen, not tolerated. "I used to think I had to apologize just for existing," she said, pulling back just enough to see his eyes in the low lamplight. "You are, mia regina," he murmured into her hair, his arms tightening around her like he had no intention of ever loosening them again. "The only one I've ever wanted to share a kingdom with." She laughed, soft and a little disbelieving, the sound of someone still adjusting to a life where she was allowed to take up exactly as much room as she wanted. Outside, the city lights blurred gold through the rain, the whole skyline stretched out beneath them like something finally, quietly won. Eleanor Hayes, once dismissed, once mocked, once made to feel invisible, stood beside the most powerful man in Chicago, his heartbeat steady against her back, her own reflection standing tall and unashamed in the glass before her. Not as someone he rescued, as someone he finally, truly saw. This story reminds us that true worth was never up to cruel people in expensive rooms to decide. Quiet women can carry a strength dangerous enough to change everything around them. Love without respect was never love at all. And the person everyone overlooks might just be the one who ends up rewriting the whole story. What did you think of Eleanor's transformation? Drop it in the comments. And if this one got you, like it, share it, subscribe for more.